Namandas, namandas, namandas. Morning. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you all today. Make sure I got this mic close to me. So this is the Dharma School message, so I'll be kind of talking to the Dharma School folks a lot, but this is also for everybody. So please join me in hearing the words of Shinran Shonin. When we take refuge in the pure land of Amida, we take refuge in all the Buddhas. To praise the one Buddha, Amida, with the mind that is single, is to praise all the unhindered ones. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. So the verse that I read today, it's one of the hymns by Shinran. So Shinran wrote some really erudite scholarly stuff, but he also wrote all these little songs in Japanese for everyday people. And I wanted to focus on this because he talks about refuge. And in our temple, we recite the three refuges every week, right? The Tisarana. Buddham saranam gacchami, Dhammam saranam gacchami. We sing it, right? With Enzo's beautiful playing, Donna's beautiful playing. It's interesting, though, that we chant that, right? Because it's not in Japanese. Mostly what we chant is in Japanese. We chant some things in English. But the three refuges are something we chant in Pali. And Pali is a language related, it's like Sanskrit. It's close to Sanskrit. It's actually closer probably to what the Buddha spoke. He didn't speak in Sanskrit because it's a really fancy language. He spoke in Pali, something like Pali in a Prakrit. It's interesting that we chant that because it's not something that's chanted in Japan. At Jodo Shinshu temples, sister temples of ours in Japan, they don't chant the three refuges. But if you go to temples in Thailand, Cambodia, if you go to temples here in town, there are Khmer American, Thai American temples, they also chant the three refuges in Pali. So it's cool. It's something we do that we share with everybody, right? So we share it with lots of Buddhists around the world. So I want to look a little bit more at this. Partly because tomorrow is a special holiday for us. We'll get to that in a second. So first, I want to ask you what the word refuge means. So I'm going to give you a second to think about it. What does it mean to you, particularly Dharma School kids, when you hear the word refuge? When we chant it with a different translation. I go to the Buddha for guidance. That's great and it's true, but it's not really what saranam means. Saranam means like a refuge. So I go to the Buddha for refuge. I go to the Dharma for refuge. So when you hear the word refuge, what does it mean to all of you folks? What kind of feeling does it give you when you hear the word refuge? I hear someone say protection. You can mumble it, that's okay. Acceptance. Oh, I like that one. Yeah. Protection, acceptance. Any other feelings or thoughts that come to mind for folks? Safety. Yeah, safety, protection, acceptance. I think these are all excellent. So every Sunday, we begin by saying we go to the Buddha for refuge. Now, tomorrow, we're doing it next weekend, but tomorrow, April 8th in the Japanese calendar is what Buddha's holiday? Hanamatsuri, yeah, a lot, good. So tomorrow is when we celebrate Buddha's birthday. Now, in different Buddhist traditions, it's done on the lunar calendar. So if you have friends who are Vietnamese American, Chinese American, Korean American, and basically anyone who's not celebrating a Japanese-derived Buddhist tradition, they'll do Buddha's birthday later. It's like usually in May sometime. And it's not always the same in different places. So Vietnam might be celebrating this day, might be this day in Thailand. We do it tomorrow, although we're going to do it next week. So which Buddha are we celebrating the birthday of? Shakyamuni, not Amida, right? We're celebrating the birthday of Siddhartha Gautama, right, who was born in Nepal. He lived, there wasn't Nepal in India back then, but he was born in what's now Nepal about 2,500 years ago. And we celebrate him because he's the teacher. He's the teacher who first taught the Dharma, who discovered its eternal truth for our world and taught it. So we are all here today because Shakyamuni lived 2,500 years ago. Right? Without him, we wouldn't know about Buddhism. It's kind of how it goes. Someone might have discovered it between then and now, but in what actually happened in history is we all depend on his life. So that's the first refuge. I take refuge. I go to the Buddha for acceptance, protection, safety. Right? The Buddha provides these things through the second refuge. What's the second refuge? I take refuge in the Dharma. What's the Dharma? The teachings. Okay, I'm loving there's enough loud I can hear you all. So yes, the teachings. So the Buddha is the first refuge is the Buddha. The second refuge is Buddhism, right? The teachings of the Buddha. Now, according to Buddhism, what the Buddha taught wasn't something he made up. It was eternal truths he discovered, right? That things are impermanent, right? That our attachment to things causes suffering. We want things not to change, but they do. That causes suffering. These things, in Buddhism, it says that he discovered these. So let's look at the third refuge. What's the third refuge? Sangha. What's the Sangha? Us, yes, us. Look around. This is the Sangha, the Buddhist community. So the first refuge, I go to the teacher for protection, acceptance, and safety. I go to the teachings for protection, acceptance, and safety. And I turn to the community for protection, acceptance, and safety. So I'm going to ask you to do something right now. I'd like you to turn to your neighbor and say two things. I take refuge in you, and you can take refuge in me. Okay? I take refuge in you. Pause. Let them say it back to you, and then you can take refuge in me. Okay? Give it a shot. Come on, Dharma School kids, I see you. Thanks for doing that. I love hearing lovely conversations. I don't want to cut it off, but I just wanted you to have that experience of feeling it, right? This temple is a community. It's been here a long time. I started coming here about 10 years ago, and I found acceptance. And I found the teachings. And I found a place that has supported me as a Buddhist. And I hope that you all find that as well in this Sangha, right, as a place of refuge. Certainly, this temple was a place of real refuge for Japanese Americans in the early and mid part of the 20th century when they were excluded from white society, for example. This temple was a refuge in many ways. It continues to be a temple as it changes and grows, as a place centered in the Dharma. Right, the teachings of Buddhism. So let's return to that verse. Please join me in Gassho. When we take refuge in the pure land of Amida, we take refuge in all the Buddhas. To praise the one Buddha, Amida, with the mind that is single, is to praise all the unhindered ones. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Namandas. Thanks. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namandas, Namandas, Namandas. Please join me in Gassho. Amida, who attained Buddhahood in the infinite past, full of compassion for beings of the 5 defilements, took the form of Shakyamuni Buddha and appeared in Gaia. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namandas, Namandas, Namandas. Good morning again. So for today's adult service talk, we're going to look at another one of Shinran Shonin's hymns, one of his wasan in Japanese. My main topic is hope. But I'm going to do that by looking at this hymn backwards, going through each part of the hymn. And that's partly because tomorrow, as we talked about before, is Hanamatsuri. So in this hymn, it says, Amida took the form of Shakyamuni Buddha and appeared in Gaia. So Shakyamuni Buddha, right, is the historical figure who was born about 2,500 years ago in Nepal, in Lumbini. Now, scholars will tell you, some scholars will tell you they know when he was born, like the year. But there's a couple different major traditions in Buddhism, textual traditions that relate the birth age of the Buddha, the birth year, and they're off by like 100 years from each other. So if a scholar ever tells you they know when the Buddha was born, they're wrong. We don't know. We have some guesses. But we're pretty sure that it was about 2,500 years ago, so 2.5 millennia ago. Often it's said that he was a king's son. He was a noble of some kind from the warrior class. So a great general, the son of a great general, a great warrior. Right? And his story is pretty well known, and we'll hear more about it next service, next week, so I'm not going to go through it. I do want to mention, though, that in Mahayana Buddhism, so the Buddhism that we're part of, there's many Buddhas. Right? There is Amida. There are Buddhas throughout the universe, because everybody needs help. Right? So there are Buddhas that appear throughout to help everybody. So as I talked about in the Dharma School message, we take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. We could say that's plural Buddhas. We take refuge in the Buddhas. As Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, we primarily focus on Amida. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what this verse says about Amida at the end. But I want to talk a little bit more about refuge. Right? So refuge in the sense of protection. We come to Buddhism for protection in a world of suffering and our own experiences of discontent, anxiety, and occasional despair. Buddhism is a refuge. Right? And so Buddhism talks a lot about suffering, which sounds pessimistic, but there is something positive in Buddhism. It is a refuge for us. This particular verse talks about something called the 5 defilements as something we need refuge from. Full of compassion for foolish beings of the 5 defilements. Right? So we hear this a lot, foolish beings, in Jodo Shinshu. But the 5 defilements, I may have talked about this before a couple years ago. I looked at my notes and I can't remember if I did. So if I can't remember, I'm hoping none of you remember. So we'll talk about it again, because I think it's helpful, especially as we move through this current political season. So what are the 5 defilements? The Gojoku. So this is a traditional Buddhist concept that talks about kind of change in our world. So when this verse says, foolish beings of the 5 defilements, it's not saying we have the 5 defilements. What the 5 defilements talk about is the conditions in which we live, the world that we're living in, the world we see on the news. So the 5 defilements is an idea in Buddhism about kind of the change over time of societies, cultures, civilizations. The 5 defilements starts with the first defilement, the defilement of kalpas. It just means the defilements of right now, like the defilements of the age, the things that are happening of this age, the trends of the present age, right? What's happening today? That's really a kind of simple way to think about it. So this is the first one. There's this notion in Buddhism that, right, because things change, things aren't always going to get better. I'll mention later, things aren't always going to get worse in Buddhism. But there is a feeling that things are getting worse. Right? If you have that feeling, that's what the defilement of the present age is in Buddhism. The present age, the decline of the present age then leads to mistaken views. That's the second defilement. This is actually the same as like a bombu, right? The kleshas, our bonno, our kind of mistaken views about things. We get attached to our views, our opinions of right and wrong. We get attached to how we think things should be. But we get attached to ideas of us and them, right? These are mistaken views according to Buddhism. This then gives rise to affliction when they become normalized. Okay? This is not how the Buddha would talk about it, but I feel like, we're modern day people, we live now, right? So things feel like they're getting worse. We have this notion that we're getting really attached to our opinions about things, and we see other people getting entrenched in their opinions. And this leads to the normalization of things like violence, fighting. And I think this is really interesting, and the scriptures say, it is when lies and fraud become accepted as truth. Right? This is the third defilement. When you live in a society and a culture, when the mistaken views of one, people stop resisting them and actually start embracing them, lies and fraud as truth. So 1 leads to 2, leads to 3. The fourth is misery increases and happiness decreases. As a result of these things happening in the world in which you live, in the society, the culture, the civilization. Misery increases, happiness decreases. And really interestingly, the fifth one then brings it back to us. There's a decrease in lifespan. So I think of this in terms of public health, right? This is the Buddha kind of weighing into public health debates, right? But it's this notion that it's not just about our internal suffering. There's a real physical result that happens to people, to populations, to bodies. This wears us down. I think today we can think about 4 and 5 in terms of increase in mental health challenges and increase in suicide rates and cancer among young people and all these kinds of things. Right? So this is a Buddhist way of thinking about it, that sometimes this happens, that you live in a world where things get worse. Now, I want to just note here that this kind of parallels something you might see in other religious traditions and even in other Buddhist traditions. It's called millenarianism, end times. Right? Certainly there's, most religions have this. We certainly hear this from some Christian denominations in the US, not all. I want to be clear about that. But some are really focused on this notion that the end times are here, they're now. This is not what Buddhism is talking about. Partly because in Buddhism, there's no end times. Things go on and on and on, right? In Buddhism, there is no beginning to the world. There is no end to the universe. It goes on and on and on. So although there is some history of millenarian movements in Buddhism, yes, there were Buddhist groups who were convinced, this happened a lot in China, that like the end is now and we need to rise up, take arms and overthrow the government and establish a Buddhist kingdom on earth. Makes the government very concerned. This is not what our tradition is about. Like Shinran was not interested in this kind of talk, right? He was not interested in the eschatological, the millenarian, the end times doom prophecy, right? He was interested in the fact that things change and sometimes they get worse. So in this notion of the 5 defilements, we see the interplay of society, of politics, public health, and happiness. That Buddhists are thinking about these things, right? It's very contemporary. It's easy, I think, to get caught in looking at the news, right? I've been trying to read less of the news recently. I don't know where you all are at with that, but I find it really hard on me. I think it's important to be connected to what's happening in the world, to be aware, but we can get involved in our doom scrolling, right? And really affect ourselves that way. It can also eat away at a sense of hope, right? Hopelessness is something that can take over us. I'm going to read a quote by Rebecca Solnit. I don't know if you're familiar with Rebecca Solnit. She's a wonderful author, thinker, public intellectual, activist. She's done a lot of work with climate activism. Her recent collaborative book is called Not Too Late. It's about the climate. So that's kind of I think that summarizes kind of where she's at. She's been involved with Buddhist circles as well. I don't know if she identifies as a Buddhist, but she sees a lot in our tradition, our larger Buddhist tradition, that she finds helpful. So she talks about hope. So here's a quote from her. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about hope. One misconception is that it is the same as optimism. But optimism is certainly about the future, whereas hope is just about, whereas optimism is certainty about the future, hope is just about possibility. Another misconception is that hope is a feeling, and that if you don't feel good, you can't be hopeful. But we know that people in the worst situations in the world dared to hope, not because they felt good, but because there was something worth doing. So I chew on that kind of thinking a lot. Right? She talks a lot about this in other ways too, that both pessimism and optimism are forms of certainty. And I would say in our Jodo Shinshu tradition, they're forms of kind of an arrogance that we know what's going to happen. Right? And a big part of our tradition is to be mindful that we don't know. Right? We have to avoid our calculative thinking. We don't know what's going to happen. So things may look bad, sure. And there may be particular things that you're paying attention to right now that are causing you a lot of suffering, that are real. Wars, death, rampant opioid addiction, all these things are real. But the Buddha's teaching of impermanence goes both ways. Right? It tells us that the good things aren't always going to stay. At the same time, the bad things can't always stay bad. If you're convinced that things will only get worse forever, or that things will only stay bad, that's not Buddhism. So that's something to chew on. You may land in a different place on that than me, but it's something I would invite you to consider. And as I want to reflect finally, in the last part of my talk, I want to reflect on the first verse. Amida, who attained Buddhahood in the infinite past. So Buddhists, especially Mahayana Buddhist scriptures, they are filled with the inconceivable, right? Things you can't imagine. If you've read any Mahayana Buddhist scriptures, there's countless Buddhas showing up, cramming into a single room, or countless rays of light, or eons of time that are beyond measure. So what is this trying to get at? Like one way we can say is, these scriptures, when they say Amida who attained Buddha infinite past, okay, they're trying to say infinite past. But another way to think about it is they're trying to get at something inconceivable, right? Our human minds can't fully wrap our heads around all the stuff. Even Shinran, right, he said Namo Amida Butsu, but he had other ways of saying that. Namo Fukashigiko. Fukashigi means inconceivable, cannot be thought through, right? The inconceivable light. Homage to the inconceivable light. So one way to, we're going to close on inconceivable. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So we're going to try to make us all conceive the inconceivable. Right? So one way to think about terms like inconceivable, especially in our religious context, is to get mystical. Right? To think about things like ESP, other dimensions, time travel, stuff like that, right? To say, he's talking about something mystical. But this is Buddhism, so I think we can also bring it back to the present, right? Always good to bring it back to our present moment that is also inconceivable. So bear with me, right? So imagine you're walking in a park, you're walking along the beach, you're in the woods, or we're just here in temple. Imagine if I asked you to describe everything that's happening right now. Imagine I just asked you to describe each of the hairs on the head of the person sitting in front of you. It would take a long time, right? But to account for everything that's happening right here, right now, you'd have to talk about the temperature, the sounds, the things you feel, the things you see, everybody here, what they're wearing, the threads in the fabric of the clothes, right? In order to even capture the present moment, it goes beyond what we can think of. Right? In terms of neuroscience, right, our brains take shortcuts. There's been a great two-part series on Nova last year about how our brains take shortcuts. Like when we look at things, we actually only see a little percentage of what's in front of us. Our eyes are dancing around and our brain is filling in everything else. And so we can't even handle seeing everything in front of us. It's too much for our brains. So the present moment is inconceivable. Amida Buddha is infinite and inconceivable. And what will happen next is inconceivable. Right? We can have a good guess about how things will turn out. We can assume the sun will rise. Right? We can assume that things are going to go a certain way. But if we're certain that the future is bleak, we're making a lot of assumptions. So I just want to leave you with that to think about. What is hope? Is hope optimism or is hope possibility? How much hope is there in Buddhism? Are we just talking about suffering, or are we also thinking about the end of suffering? So please join me in Gassho. Amida, who attained Buddhahood in the infinite past, full of compassion for foolish beings of the 5 defilements, took the form of Shakyamuni Buddha and appeared in Gaya. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namandas.